welcome. Thank you all very much for joining the second webinar from our series, Agricultural Data Governance in Canada is the topic for today. Before we get into the topic and introductions, I'd like to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. We're joining today from many different places, but as an organizing group, we'd like to acknowledge that we're grateful to live, work, play, and eat on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of many Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Squamish, Salo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Talking about agriculture and governance in Canada, it is especially important to think about how these implications play out. And we encourage you all to take a moment to think about where you're joining today. So this is the second webinar of a series called Ethical Data Governance for Agriculture. We're very excited to be bringing this together from researchers at the University of British Columbia, myself, Sarah Louise Reuter, and Professor Hannah Whitman, and then the BC Agricultural Climate Action Research Network led this collaboration led by Shauna McKinnon. If you missed our first webinar, it is recorded, and we will record this one as well as we put together a toolkit of resources on ethical data governance in agriculture. So today we're talking about the Canadian policy context. The Privacy Act and the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act are the two pieces of legislation that govern personal information as a type of data at the federal level. We'll hear more about how these things play out when our experts speak, but I'd like to remind you that we have a short video available to watch in advance of this presentation if you are watching from the recording, or after this presentation if you're joining us live, with an overview of policy in Canada. So here is the link for the video, and here is the link for last session. Shauna, would you like to bring us through the overview?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah Louise, for getting us started, and apologies everyone for the incorrect link for logging in that was sent out. Glad everyone has managed to join now. I'm just going to go over, so I'm Shauna McKinnon, I'm the coordinator for the BC Agricultural Climate Action Research Network, and I'm just going to go over a couple of quick logistics for our session and then introduce our moderator and we'll get going. So in terms of logistics, today's session will be recorded and that will be made available both to all the registrants as well as posted publicly on the BC ACRN YouTube channel and on our website. And as you know, if you've joined the last session, we are putting together a toolkit of resources following this series, and the recordings will be part of that toolkit. We will have plenty of time for questions today and discussion. So first, you can use the chat box to introduce yourself because it's great to see who's joining us today. And then when you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A box, and you'll find that at the bottom in your Zoom panel. In the Q&A box, you can also upvote other people's questions, and that will move them up in the queue, and we'll ask those questions first. So definitely, as the speakers are presenting and questions are coming up for you, feel free to type them in at any time. We'll have a short break for questions just after the first presenter, and then we'll have a longer time for Q&A following that and discussion. I think that's it from me. So now I'm going to pass things over to our moderator today, Serena Black. Serena is a science research specialist with Industry Forestry Service in Prince George, British Columbia. She's also the manager for the BC Forage Council, and she's an environmental farm plan advisor. We are excited to have Serena moderating today, and we asked her to join us for today's session specifically so that she could bring her experience in field research and extension and working directly with farmers in the central and northern parts of the province. So the Cariboo, Highway 16, Bulklina, Chaco areas. She works with a lot of cattle ranchers and forage producers, and it's a really interesting group of producers to be working with when it comes to data information. So some unique circumstances there. So part of Serena's role today is helping to bridge between government and academic perspectives and that field level experience of farmers and agricultural organizations. So thank you so much, Serena, for joining us today to be our moderator. I'm going to pass things over to you. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Shauna. I'm really excited to be here. As mentioned, I am based maybe in I like to say the very middle of the province, so on the traditional unceded territories of the Lheidli where the two rivers meet, the Fraser River and the Nechako River. So very excited to be here today. And one of the best parts of my job is to be able to work one-on-one with producers and really get a good sense of where their interests are, their needs are, how they're accessing information and data and utilizing that for management practices. So very excited to be a part of this discussion here today. And we are very lucky to have two experts in the field of agricultural data governance in Canada to help us lead us through these conversations. We do have Élise Legendre, who is the first Chief Data Officer for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which is a relatively new position in the government offices. Élise has 19 years of experience working for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada on a wide range of policies and programs, including 2 years as Director of Strategic Management and Reporting. In addition, she holds a Master's in Business Administration from Simon Fraser University. We also have Kelly Bronson joining us today, who is a Canada Research Chair and Assistant Professor at the University of Ottawa. Kelly is one of the leading experts researching the design and governance of novel technologies in agriculture and has many years of research experience with farmers and farming organizations, which she discusses in her recent book, The Immaculate Conception of Data. She is also the advisor on various committees and applied projects in Canada and internationally. So without any further ado, we will pass it over to our speakers here today. And I believe we are going to start with Élise Legendre to get us going.
Yes, thank you very much, Serena. Thank you, Shauna. Thank you, Sarah Louise, for having us today. I'm looking forward to the discussion we're going to have. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation in the National Capital Region in Ottawa. So I want to be clear, I'm always a little bit, I find it always interesting to be called an expert, but as Serena said, the Chief Data Officer position is a fairly new position. So I really feel like I think the real expert is my fellow panelist, Kelly Bronson, on data governance. What I'm bringing to the table is my experience from a federal department point of view, the opportunities and challenges associated with data transformation, which are very much dependent on good governance. That's really my angle to come here. So I'm the first Chief Data Officer at AFC with an actual office. So I actually have a team working with me on these questions. It's a new position. It was created in the summer of 2021. But before I get too much into this, let me just talk to you about me a little bit. So I'm an analyst at heart. I love data. I love the story we can tell with it, the quality of the decision we're able to make when we harness it. And let's not forget how much administrative burden we can and could save if we did data right in our organization. And I think it's true for the federal government, but I think it's true throughout the ecosystem, the agriculture and agri-food ecosystem. I do have very bad allergies today, so I'm sorry if I catch my breath a little bit and I might have to take a little bit of water, but I appreciate your empathy for this. So following a career in the private sector, I joined the public service now almost 20 years ago. I've spent my whole public service career at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I actually started in the BC regional office as a commerce officer working with industry stakeholder. I then moved to Ottawa, where I spent a decade in program policy and delivery before moving on to some stints in strategic policy and corporate that Serena alluded to. I'll be honest, when I joined the public service, I did it to get paid sick leave. I had a young son, and the consulting world was not the best when it comes to balancing career and raising a family. But I stayed because I quickly realized that there was a lot of great challenges and opportunities to tackle with a bunch of talented and smart people. And I know it will sound corny, but it's my truth. I really feel like we can really make a difference for the greater good. Those two things, contributing to the greater good and the service aspect of the public service, really speak to me. And it's really about, you know, how that's why the data is so important, is that ability to make those better decisions, to be able to have evidence to orient policy. A little bit about Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, or AAFC, the way I talk about it all the time. It's a science-based department, which means that in addition to program and corporate data, we're also a big data generator. We have about 6,000 people that work across the country in offices and research settings, both in labs and in fields. AAFC is a leader in agriculture research in Canada, and a lot of that work is done collaboratively with partners in academia, hospitals, industry, and other government, here and abroad. The department also supports the sector when it comes to sustainable economic growth and trade, in close collaboration with other federal departments, the provincial and territorial government. We work with Indigenous peoples to advance reconciliation and lead on the food policy which support the Zero Hunger Sustainable Development Goal. Canadian farmer, rancher, food processor, and manufacturers are key driver of economic growth and significant contributor to the global food security. Furthermore, Canada is acknowledged as a global leader in agri-food innovation, from precision agriculture and other data-driven technologies such as AI to automation and robotics. All of these areas generate, use, and are hungry for data, and we know that strong data governance is required to advance the digital transformation of the sector. So, give me a second. So what about data governance? Relatively, no, there's no, I'm sorry, I'm just doing speaking points. There's no slides to answer the questions coming from the chat. Relatively speaking, the data governance is a relatively new area for governments. The first federal data strategy roadmap was published in 2018, which called upon departments to get themselves organized to ensure that they could leverage data as an asset. AAFC created its first data strategy in 2019, and the CDO, my role, was created in 2021, along with a growing team focused on leading the departmental data strategy and government's implementation. Initially, the role of the Chief Data Officer was created to address very much internal data question in the department, the opportunities and the challenge. Not that we've solved all of them, but we're working on setting up our governance to make sure that we're treating the data that we have well as the asset that it is, but also with respect to the place where the data originates, its ownership, and what we can do with it. There is recently more of that outside focus in terms of how do we make sure that that fair and equitable data governance goes beyond just the department, and how can we help support and be that voice to advance that the good practices in the industry and with the sector. The AFC approach to data governance supports and echoes the federal data strategy. The last iteration of the federal data strategy was released just about a month ago on April 21st, 2023. Post-pandemic, we started our own refresh of the data strategy, and it's currently on the way with target completion this year. So we realized that the first data strategy was developed very much with an analytics perspective, right? Which, like, how can we use the data to, the more of the economics aspect of it. But since the pandemic, I think it's highlighted the need to look at data a lot more from the tech angle as well, right? How can we be more effective in using systems and technology to ensure that we manage our data well, and not just fit for purpose, but why we consider other application for the data with consent, obviously, from the folks that are providing this data. Internally, we're working to coordinate the silos of excellence across the department. We're taking a non-invasive approach, light touch based on our subject matter experts. We have a lot of subject matter experts, particularly when it comes to agri-food data. And we're giving time for the business line to learn, adjust, and adapt to more formalized roles. So a lot of the work that we're doing internally is that definition of roles and responsibility relative to data. The work is accomplished through an active and engaged and growing data stewardship network that is voluntary at the moment, but has more than 40 members already, less than a year after its foundation. Much like the sector, AFC is a large, nationally dispersed and diverse organization. Changing the data culture takes time, and we're focused on building trusting relationship with our subject matter expert who will help us define and lead process and standard development and improvement to take us to the next level of data governance maturity. In that sense, AFC's journey to data maturity is quite on par with other federal departments. Some are more advanced, while others are still in the process of appointing their chief data officer. We have a senior management that is very engaged, and that is supporting of those activities. The creation of the OCDO speaks to the commitment to data governance and improvement. We're not alone as a department. Federal working group like the CDO Council and the GC Data Lead, the Government of Canada Data Lead, are active communities of practice for sharing excellence and best practices. There's really a desire, I think, in this sphere to see departments come together and to see stakeholders come together to work through those questions collaboratively, because we're all subject to it, and there's so much work to be done, and there's so many angles to consider. So I see that collaboration throughout. I don't want to take too much time either. I really want to leave time for more of the discussion. I think we'll talk about what's driving the need for data collection and other things as we discussed, but I think I'll leave it at this for now, Serena, if that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Élise. Just going to encourage everybody to bring in some questions now. If you want to type those into the Zoom chat, I've been waiting to see. Sometimes it takes a few minutes as they digest the discussion and the topics and moving forward. That would be great. I see a lot of movement happening on the mural, so I'm trying to also keep track of all of that. One question that and my apologies if I've misunderstood some of the pieces, Élise, but the one question that kind of came in really early on is thinking about the difference between collecting and handling data for the public research versus the commercial and private use. And I know a lot of the discussion that you've started off is, I believe, more on the public realm of things, but do you have any initial thoughts on that question that came in to get us started?
So definitely from my point of view, I'm looking at it more from the data that is collected for the research that we do, and we're public government. I think that we also collect there's like three big types of data, right? There's the research data that is being collected by our scientists, and then there's all the corporate data that we collect in terms of pay and financial and these kinds of information from our organization. And then finally, there's the program data, where we have a lot of programs that collect data from farmers. In our realm, I'm really looking at that data for the public good, right? Not so much in the commercial aspect of things. That's more of our Office of Intellectual Property and in other areas that would think about this. I'm really more looking at it from this analytics perspective and the collection of those types of data.
Mm-hmm. And it does sound like you have quite a bit of your own vast experience working directly with producers and farmers from that perspective. How have you been able to incorporate that experience into your new role and this new role that Agriculture Canada has taken on?
I think it's an interesting, thank you for the question, Serena. It's an interesting world right now. I think I have that experience with producer and with frontline, particularly on the program side. And I think that where it becomes interesting is there's really two sides to data in our world. There's the what I call the hard side, the more tech side, the data pipelines, the how do you connect things, and the more platform and digital. And on the other side, there's that more soft skills in terms of what are the agreements, what is the consent, what is the data being used for, how do I make sure that my privacy is protected. But in the same area, there's so much that can be gained throughout the value chain if we manage that data well, and if we bring this together, that I think if we bring all the partners at the table and we're clear on what the objectives is for the data and what we're doing with it and how we want to move this forward and what's in it for the different partner, we get to some very interesting product and very interesting avenues to explore and address challenges.
Absolutely. And I definitely have a few key things that have popped up during my experience in BC around that ownership and what the implications are. But maybe I'll put a pin on that for later in our conversation, because I know we'll have more time for questions after our second presentation. And I don't want to lose that there was a follow-up and a clarification to the first question that I asked you around the research use versus commercial and private. They clarified, they wanted to, the question was also kind of thinking about the ethics and how are the ethics different in collecting public versus private use data?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think that even it's all about that transparency, right? What are you collecting the data for, and being very open. And I think the onus on the public research is greater than on the commercial one. And that's definitely a place where we need to continue and advance the conversation and the dialogue so folks understand what's happening. And we often think about the for the Internet of Things, for example, right? There's tons of data that are being collected that I'm not even sure we understand that those data are being collected and used. I often give the example of, people are reticent to provide some information when they apply on program because they're worried about their privacy, for example, but they all have a Facebook profile where they're sharing much more granular and detailed information that is being used in ways that they don't think about. So I think that's a place where we need to find a middle ground.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting example that you gave, as my first degree was in journalism, actually, and kind of was coming around the same time social media was. So when I found out that as soon as you post something on Facebook, as a journalist, I can pull it without your permission and utilize it, I think I became very aware very quickly. But same idea. As an environmental farm plan advisor, I get a lot of concern over privacy and a lot of producers who only let me on farm because I can specifically say that I am independent, non-government representative that's really there for educational and partnership rather than in a strict compliance enforcement kind of perspective, and building that. There can be challenges with trust. Maybe
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you're on to, like, with the trust is important. The being clear about what our intentions are is important. I'll give you the flip side of that too, right? Like if we can find a way to ensure that we gather good consent, people are also reticent to providing the information over and over and over and over again, and their consent over and over and over again, which puts a lot of administrative burden. It maybe makes it more difficult for programs to really provide the coverage that they can or the support that they can. So there are some benefits that we can go derive from this, but you're right, trust is a big issue. What are we doing with this data? How are we doing it? How are we using it? And making sure that we inform our participants.
Yeah, absolutely. Working with Living Labs, we've already been starting to think about those aspects for working on one aspect of BC's Living Labs and that data governance. So I don't want to take too much time, so I'll end with one additional question that seems very fitting to you, Élise, before we switch over to Kelly. So the question that's come in is that, do you have a sense that the federal departments are lock in step regarding the data governance, or do you feel that some departments are really taking the lead?
Well, I think some departments are taking the lead. I think particularly the central agency. I have to say it's probably the most, in my 20-year career, the most connected community, the chief data officer community. So there is definitely there's a community of mind of the vision and where we want to go. And I invite you to take a look at the data strategy, the federal data strategy that was just published. It's available online, and it was really a collaborative effort. So we're probably not all at the same step in the journey to that vision, but definitely align in terms of where that vision is coming, with PCO, the Treasury Board Secretariat, and Statistics Canada being kind of the ringleaders that are bringing us together at the table. So in that sense, I can say that in my experience, that's probably the most aligned I've seen federal department. Does that mean we're all at the same place at the same time in the journey? No. But we're going to the same place.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I think we often hear the typical different agencies working in silos. So it's great to hear that some of those are breaking down, and obviously, at different stages. But seeing that collaboration and hearing that is pretty refreshing. So thank you. And with that, I do want to make sure, I think it's time we'll switch over to our second presenter, Kelly Bronson, who is assistant professor at the University of Ottawa. And I'll try not to make any comments being a Carleton alumni, Kelly, but let's just share the love for Ottawa itself. But welcome to the discussion here. And it looks like you're starting to share your screen, so I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we can be proud to both be from Ottawa. So like Élise, I live on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And thank you, Élise. That was really informative. And thank you for your leadership, especially when it comes to internal data usage by Government of Canada and Agriculture, Agri-Food in particular. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So I want to start by saying that I share in Élise's enthusiasm about data and using data for good. That, you know, I begin from the premise that data and the use of big data in particular and could really drive value along the food system or food value chain. But it's precisely because of that value that I think we really need to anticipate or think very carefully about who's controlling the data and who stands to gain or potentially be harmed by the use of data in agriculture. So those are the kinds of questions that I ask in some of my research, and that I'm going to talk about today. I want to say that, you know, as someone who years ago I started a book project. The book has now been published, and the primary goal of the book was actually I wanted to just trace basically where data was going from the farm. So I showed that screen capture from John Deere's precision ag strategy. You know, that's just one player in this big system we might call data-driven farming or precision farming or smart farming. But I wanted to look, especially in the case of data collected on the farm from tractors, but also from near and remote sensing, I wanted to get a sense of who was collecting the data, where they were going, what was being done with the data. And I have to say that actually doing that kind of investigative research, it was kind of like investigative journalism, actually. It was really difficult, because in many cases, figuring out where the data go and what the data sets look like, how they're configured, and then how they're structured, how models are developed, right? How the algorithms are written that then derive advice for farmers, the decision support platforms using these big data sets, data aggregated across farms or across users. The data and the scientists and the algorithms are all protected by legal mechanisms from a kind of critical oversight. And I would say this is one of the things that really should lead the conversation around data governance, which is a lack of transparency, right? I mean, at the very basic level, how can we validate systems that are generating advice for farmers if nobody can see their workings? So that's one of the sort of, I guess, high level points that I wanted to make today. But I also wanted to just go over some of the research I've done, again, published into this book, but also publications, to trace the data and figure out who's benefiting from the data usage and what are some potential governance issues or issues that really ought to be addressed by regulatory policy, but other kinds of governance mechanisms. So this is a lot, I know, on one slide, and I'm just going to address one of these rows. Because it's a lot of information. But so we're just going to look at the first row. So, you know, obviously, you know, there's data being collected from the precision equipment on farm. And where do those data go? Well, they're used, right? They're aggregated, as probably most of the farmers and policy folks in the room know, by corporations, right? They go to cloud-based infrastructure, they're aggregated, and then they're used in with AI, in particular machine learning algorithms, to drive predictions that help generate information for farmers that can amend their farm practices, right? Make them more precise. For example, recommend certain areas of the field that need more attention, for example, with chemical inputs. And so I wanted to just point out that obviously farm data, one of the beneficiaries, so that's the second column here, right, of the kind of data collected from precision equipment, one of the beneficiaries the groups that might benefit from this usage of data are farmers, as probably Serena could attest to, or she probably has firsthand experience. So I think there's a need to, and this could be something that the public sector leads in, and I've been trying to do some of this work, take stock of the evidence around the benefits for farmers and around particular, say, sustainability or productivity metrics. And I know that the Living Labs Network is collecting its own data for such kind of measurement. But I just wanted to say that, that's one of the potential beneficiaries is farmers, right? The benefit of using data to help drive better management decisions, especially in concert with machine learning or AI. But in this example, what I have found, and I can talk in the question period about my sources of evidence, having said that it's really hard to find out what's happening with the data, where they're going, and how the algorithms work. I've had to use a whole host of sources of evidence, which I don't want to talk about methods in our brief time, but I'm happy to answer questions on that. But one of the things I will say is that there are additional benefits to the corporations. So the company benefits monetarily, right? So in the case of the John Deere screen capture, like they have a decision support platform that farmers can access, but farmers pay for access. So that's one way that companies benefit from the use of data, in particular big data in farming, right? They now sell, as Tobias Neen from Bayer says, they sell information as well as inputs. Right, so the companies benefit in terms of the payment for a licensing fee around the use of the data-driven systems. But the company also benefits, likely benefits from the data themselves. And I think this is really important because it's not always visible. I think a lot of people know this in the context of social media, for example, but they don't necessarily think of this in the context of farm or even more broadly environmental data. But I think there's evidence to show that that companies who are collecting the data, or companies that share the data with the companies collecting the data, and we know that data sets have been transferred from John Deere to other input supply companies, have the ability to monetize the data sets or to use the data to generate profit themselves. So for example, right, there's some evidence that I found in financial reporting and in a close read of the licensing agreements from some of the large companies that now collect data or use data-driven or analytics, that they're using data analytics to drive research internal to the companies, to perfect, right? To say, for example, to generate insight or to predict weed and pest pressures and therefore drive research and development. That's a kind of additional benefit, right, to the companies of this kind of data-based insight. But I think there's also, we can make inferences that the companies, and in particular here, I'm not talking about small startups, I'm not talking about public sector, I'm talking about the already large and concentrated companies, and I've shown a screen capture here of a visual statistic generated by the agricultural economist Phil Howard, right? These are like the Fab Four, he calls it, right? Really concentrated oligopoly input supply corporations, those that supply farmers seeds and chemicals. We know that historically these companies have used their market advantage and power to set prices to the disadvantage of farm communities. The National Farmers Union has beautiful graphs. We know this has happened historically. And I think we can infer, I don't think it's an exaggeration, that data analytics, that the data in concert again with machine learning and predictive analytics are going to be used to predict for these companies, right, areas of, for example, chemical need and allow them a kind of, right, advantage and the ability to price set. And it's really hard to find the evidence that this has happened recently because this is pretty recent, right, the use of machine learning. And the companies are not super forthcoming about this practice, but here's just one bit of evidence. So in a close reading of the privacy policies around climate field view, so this is a decision support platform, Bayer Monsanto's. In their 2019 privacy policy, they claimed explicitly that they would not use personal data or aggregated farm data for the purpose of seed pricing. But in 2023, that language is missing now from the privacy policy. So according to, I work very closely with legal scholars, copyright and intellectual property colleagues at the University of Ottawa. They have said that it's not an unfair inference to suggest that this is leaving space for these companies to do what they have done historically, which is now use data as an advantage to set prices to the disadvantage of farmers, right, who are squeezed on the commodities market between low commodity prices and high input prices. So one of my overall sort of governance concerns is around what I might call the Matthew effect, right? That data, while they for sure, and I agree with Élise, obviously, and using informatics to drive insights, whether it's policy insights or safety along, supply management along the food chain, or even farm level decisions, I think there is real potential. But my concern, my larger high level governance concern, is that this could be, play into the Matthew effect, which is that data are now another tool to allow the already powerful and wealthy actors in the food system to become even more powerful and wealthy. And so this is exactly why we need leadership, like Élise's wonderful leadership, not just to look internally at data usage, but also to think about regulation of data usage, the collection of data from farms, right? And the usage by the private sector. And I would say privacy for sure is a concern. And I agree, in my interviews with farmers from across Canada, they have concerns about privacy, about corporate and even governmental oversight via data. But I think there are other broader issues that don't get enough attention and that I want to foreground in advance of our conversation, our discussion on regulation and governance. And that's equity. So what I pointed out with the Matthew effect, right? I think we need real regulatory, in particular leadership, to ensure that the benefits from data accrue equitably between the example I pointed out was between farmers and agribusiness, right? And so how could that be done? Well, one idea is instead of regulating the data or the models, right, the algorithmic models, why not use regulatory tools to regulate the business models? Use antitrust or competition law, right, to regulate the lack of competition in the food system. And I know that's no small feat. We've been talking, those of us in food studies, about the lack of competition in the food system for 75 years. But that's just one possible, right, non-obvious regulatory tool, like it's been done in Europe, right, with under the leadership of Margaret Vestager, use competition law to regulate big tech. In this case, we're regulating big ag. Because the corporate concentration raises other issues like a lack of interoperability for farmers in the different database tools on offer, right? And that comes from competition among a small number of players in the system who cannot work together. Okay, there are other tools though, potentially for governance tools for more equitable uses of data. And these are regulatory approaches that have really been pioneered in conversations with farm partners in the global south. And so here I'm thinking of a report done by a nonprofit organization with Bill and Melinda Gates, and I point you to the report using their website or URL on the bottom here. But they generate case studies for data governance. Some are like about the co-design of data frameworks. I think the cat's out of the gate for commercial data systems in the global north at this point, so that's not a possibility. But I think there is a possibility for example, data trusts. And I know that Government of Canada, I know Élise is maybe working on this, but also for data fiduciary kind of data governance, such that there could be monetary benefit that comes to farmers from the collection of their data. Said differently, if data are themselves proving to be an asset, right, a means by which corporations or private entities can create profit, why wouldn't farmers be compensated for those data, for that data collection, right? And so there are methods and there are case studies in this report. I urge you to look at it. I don't have time to go into detail into any of these data trusts or data fiduciary sharing arrangements. But the last thing I would say is transparency. Oh, I didn't have that. Sorry. One other, so equity and transparency are the things I want to sort of raise attention around. Back to that black box, right? How can people like me who are really trying to ask questions about what are the benefits and for whom, and how do we manage those benefits equitably? I can't do the work that I need to do without transparency. So I think we need regulatory tools that generate transparency, asking a corporation to make visible, right, their proprietary algorithm is not going to happen, but I have ideas, and other clever people, including lawyer colleagues at the university, have ideas around third-party kind of transparency, or at least reporting measures on algorithms in the ag sector. So the very last point I wanted to make, and it fits actually with Élise's main point, I think, about consultation, is I actually think we need to broaden the conversation beyond just consumers, as in farmers or end users, but to think about citizens across the food system. And I think that the government of Canada actually, vis-a-vis agricultural data, I'm at a conference actually right now in Montreal on big data and AI, including on governance. And I can tell you that agriculture hardly makes it into the conversation, as probably many people know, right? With the conversations around data, around AI and data governance are about use cases like weaponry most often. But agriculture is so important. It's so important, and it's so important for Canada, right, as a sector, if we just think of the number of people in Canada connected to the agri-food sector. So I urge the Canadian government, maybe this is specifically to Élise, why not take a leadership position on big data and AI in general, right? You said that Treasury Board with the directive and the privacy office of the, or Privy Council, sorry, was taking leadership. But I actually think that AEFC could take leadership on agricultural data and help establish the Canadian leadership in the bigger conversation on big data and AI. And here's my broad idea. I think we need to step back and convene deliberative democratic consultations or public conversations to actually get at what should be prioritized in regulation of farm data in the first place. Right? Are the priorities equity and transparency, like I've said they ought to be? Or are they privacy? Are most people, citizens, concerned about privacy? I think we need a broader conversation that is highly structured in order, like was done, for example, with the new impact assessment legislation by ECCC. We need a kind of public consultation to get at, even first principles, what are the values that we then would be aligning with data usage, either internally or externally in government? And we need to develop robust institutional frameworks for realizing justice in farm data use. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I was taking a bunch of notes and have lots of thoughts and reflections based off of my own experience. And what I find it's really great to have both Élise and Kelly here. I feel like we're getting closer to having those discussions on the differences and considerations between the public research realm versus the potential commercialization and challenges there. And I know we keep seeing a lot of different questions coming through. You can upvote questions. I'll let everybody know that. And I think I'm trying to, there's so many places I want to go. I don't know where we should be starting. And maybe just as a point of reflection in a BC context to kind of what you were just talking about, or what are the concerns on the commercialization? And I think we can I see it really in two different ways, where there, in the more rural area, I think there's a lot more concern around the trust with government and policies and how that data is going to be utilized. And because of the challenges with connectivity, they might not be they might not be in a place to be able to adopt a lot of the AI technology compared to the more intensive agriculture areas. So it's kind of like I can see all these different places that we could really dig in and think about this in a little bit more. There was no question in there. That was just kind of my initial thoughts.
No, I think that's a really good point, in a way that, what I'm talking about are really the precision equipment, and maybe even when you're talking about the decision support platforms, those are the most kind of, I don't want to say sophisticated, but technically sophisticated and expensive tools. And you're right, if we look at the adoption studies, they're really only being used on capital intensive, really large acreage farms in Midwestern Canada. And so we're not, we're talking about data governance. You're right, there are issues that are broader. And so it comes to that question about public sector versus private sector. And you're right, what about the other kinds of data collected, say, by the public sector and people in rural areas that aren't on those capital intensive farms? I think that there's just a lot to discuss, and I only had 10 minutes today. I focus on that because, and it comes to that question, if I were to have answered that question, what about public versus private usage? Are there different ethical standards, right, to which we would hold public versus private sector? I would say yes, and this is what Élise said, right? The public sector has a responsibility right, to citizens, and in the case of AAFC, to the sector, right, to industry. And so that actually makes Élise's job very difficult because you then need to think about those, as Serena said, rural actors who aren't, the data usages that aren't those big variable rate and the kinds of uses that I was talking about. And so maybe there the concerns are, as you said, Serena, with trusting government, right? And transparency within government about uses of government data, or maybe the concern there is with access in the first place, right? Broadband. And I know that Government of Canada, including AAFC, is spending lots of money to try to develop that infrastructure to generate access or more equitable access to these tools or to digital agriculture. The reason in my research, and I highlighted today, though, the sort of large commercial entities, is because, if I think that while the public sector has a kind of ethical mandate to consider, right, things like data justice, access, transparency, equity, I think that the harms that are likely to arise from data usage, from farm data, and maybe environmental data collection more broadly, those harms are most acute, I think, when we look at the usage by the really already powerful entities. I mean, coming back to that Matthew effect point. So that's why my background's in plant science, but I'm currently a social scientist, and I really care about the equitable distribution of environmental goods and the equitable distribution of harms, right? And so if we think about harm, my concern is that the harms are likely, the acute harms are likely going to arise from the use of farm data by these powerful actors. And that's something that regulation, I think, should and ought to address.
Yeah, and I think that yeah. And again, I think with your response, it kind of leads me to a question that was actually brought up in our first session that we didn't have time to address. And that, and is honestly the conversation that I've had since the start of me working with producers, and because I was talking about breeding and getting proper access to the right cultivars. But the question was around the right to repair farm equipment. So you're buying these higher tech pieces of equipment that require specialty services. And so the question is that the right to repair farm equipment demonstrates a lack of control by producers over an essential aspect of the production. And how is the dialogue being translated in the use of digital technology? And the follow-up is what is the risk of non-participation into these technologies to producers, or thinking about those subscriptions or fee for access business models that really kind of poses that risk to fair participation? Any additional thoughts kind of around those questions coming from the last session?
To me or Élise?
I was going to start with you, but
Okay,
we can probably start opening it up to a full conversation, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right to repair, interestingly, I feel is one of those conversations around farm data access and AI that has generated a kind of wider attention, and it's a really important problem, right? It's, and that's again a problem with, I would say, copyright law or the interpretation of copyright law. So it's the interpretation, right, of copyright law that allows John Deere to implement a kind of digital lock, right, and a particular licensing structure around vehicles that effectively prevents farmers from tinkering. And it's a problem. It's a problem in terms of access to the equipment. It's a problem around ownership. Like, is the equipment actually owned? Not really. It's licensed, right? And that's a kind of ethical problem in and of itself. It's a problem for the timing of farming, right? If farmers have to then go through, because of this digital log, a certified John Deere dealer, and probably people know this issue. I would say it's part of a broader problem, which is the use of these legal tools to obfuscate. That's why I said transparency to me is one of the biggest. It's kind of like it should be, I think, one of the most immediate principles to leverage in talking about agricultural data governance, because the lack of transparency prevents, or the interpretation of copyright law prevents farmers from tinkering. It could prevent, right, or it could allow for a cybersecurity attack on our food system, right, because the tractors are digitally our digital vehicles, right? And because it's centrally controlled, there's a potential, right, for, I guess, a nefarious actor to hit the kill switch on tractors across the North American food system. So it presents cybersecurity issues. It presents issues as well to researchers like myself, as I said at the outset, right? So the copyright law, the intellectual property law, and also trade secrecy law really prevent people from, including farmers, but farmers don't have time. This is my job as a researcher, right? Prevent people from accessing the data and the algorithms in order to validate, right? To see how they're generating advice. One of the things I didn't talk about, and this is pointed out by others as well, the decision support platforms generate advice for prescriptions that recommend products within the sort of ecosystem of products within the same company. Some people might say that's a vested interest, or even a conflict of interest. Maybe it's not, though, but how can we know, as a kind of critical third party like myself as an independent researcher, if I can't validate the algorithms and the advice being generated? So I think transparency and using mechanisms, and again, I said I had ideas which I didn't have time to talk about for generating transparency around agricultural data use. Private sector, but maybe also public sector is one of the things that should be, but that will require an amendment of it'll require legal reform, because currently copyright and intellectual property law and trade secrecy law prevent that. Maybe Élise has ideas.
Yeah, Élise, we'll pass it over to you. Any additional thoughts?
Kelly knows her stuff very well. She's that's what I said. She's the expert here for sure. I think there's a lot. I stated at the beginning, I think the data world is a new area for government in that strategic and like organized fashion. So I think that there's something about even the basic standard development, right? Data standard development. We're missing some of those foundational tools, I would say, or foundational pieces, so that we're able to get that view. But some of the things Kelly said resonated with me in terms of even like getting access to the data to be able to measure whether or not we're inferring that there's some nefarious activity or there's some like very self-interest activities, and the ability to verify would be very interesting. And I'm curious to see, we're seeing initiatives such as the Agri-Data Transparent certification, for example, right, which is very grassroots to an extent, and is trying to bring that world of regulation and laws and everything else, and companies are signing up to these things. And I wonder if there is opportunity in those areas, in those ecosystems, to start like trying things out. And that's one thing we're trying to do here at AFC. Like it's a huge ocean to boil, right? And we need to start focusing on experiment and smaller projects to start verifying, ground truthing some of those things and moving them forward. And that's where I see an office like mine being a partner, in a sense of where can we advance? Like in this ocean of things, changing a regulation takes time, changing a law takes even longer. Are there places where we can make progress if we bring the players around the table? And I'm maybe naively optimistic, but I think there's some grounds to be made there, and some interesting learning for all of us, right? And again, that ground truthing and the validation of those assumptions, having access to the data, having the people around the table getting to it. But the other point I wanted to go back to is, I do think the information asymmetry is a very risky area, right? And that trust from producer, how do we, and that's why I love that Agri-Transparent, Agri-Data Transparent. I never just say the word in the right order, but I think that's because it is bringing people around the table and understanding and starting to, like, I don't think we have all the answer. I'm not even sure we have all the questions, but if we don't start together looking at how we can build that dialogue and build those safe space where we can talk and experiment, I think we'll get somewhere.
Yeah, it's really encouraging to be having this conversation. I think it kind of comes back to a lot of the things I just hear so regularly from producers of thinking about BC in particular. I feel like we are having kind of a capacity issue of even just qualified agrologists who can provide this information and this advice. And then there is this inherent distrust that if you are getting your data and your recommendations from the dealer, that it's always going to be more than then it might not be exactly what you need. There might be a different reason they're pushing through it. So I really do see, like I really resonate with the idea of the needing to ground truth the data that is being collected, and is it leading to the right advice? And for me, a lot of that comes down to the need for baseline data, and across, we always like to call BC supernatural. We're working with a really complex geographies and microclimates. And if all the data for these algorithms are coming from, say, the prairies or other regions, are we even getting to the point where we're providing the right kind of suggestions to the producers? And is it going to make economic sense? There's a lot of like concern and distrust there. And that's assuming they have connectivity to do it, and moving forward. Just really interesting conversation there. And I'm going to start going into some of the other questions coming in. There are a lot. The one that's been upvoted quite a bit is where I'll start. So given the need for trust from producers, as well as the department and sector's environmental goals, what will be the role of Agriculture Canada to play in enabling data collection from producers to monitor greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental metrics? Maybe I'll pass over to Élise.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think we need to be careful here, like too, right? My presence here is as a chief data officer for AAFC, right? So I don't have the answer to all the question on everything. The GHG, just recently we had the sustainable agriculture strategy that was launched, and there's some working groups that are federal, provincial, territorial, and government, and also with industry, I think in some cases, to start talking about the point of data that we need to monitor to be able to measure the results and advance the conversation. So I think this is a very live conversation in many areas. I do think there is tremendous opportunity to look at what is being done on farm to contribute to that climate change action. I'm not sure we've totally cracked that nut yet. This is definitely an area my office is supporting other parts of the department in considering options and novel ways to look at this, to be able to get, like you talk about BC being a complex ecosystem, like you can expand that to the rest of the country, right, with variation. And then you get to the question of how precise, like I think when you're talking about agronomic information on farm, like the advice and guidance and things like that, you want a very high level of precision and everything else. But what kind of level of precision do you want in terms of measuring for the country, and how much precision do you need? But I think it's an important question. I think there's a lot of good brains looking at it, and not just internally, which I find very encouraging. I think somebody mentioned the living labs. There's other areas where we're trying to tackling those questions. It's not just in Canada, honestly, it's across the world. And there's some tools that exist that measure certain things in a certain way for a long time. But are there other ways we could use that big data and those analysis in a way to give us that public and agreed upon, I would say, view of what's happening on these fronts?
Yeah, I have a couple follow-up comments, but any comments from Kelly before? I don't want to take over conversations by any means.
No, I think that was great. I mean, it was a question about what can government do to use data, I think, to help with emissions targets, and that's one of the hopes, right, that I share in that. You know, the thought is that in using machine learning in particular, mining big data, you can make a kind of use predictive analytics basically to create management advice for farmers where they can make more judicious use of inputs, which have greenhouse gas emission implications, right, especially in the production end of agrochemicals, but also in terms of fossil fuel efficiency for vehicles, for example. So like of the hundreds of sensors on the John Deere tractor, many of them are monitoring the efficiency of the tractor. And so even in private sector innovation in terms of using those predictive analytics to say, for example, perfect the vehicle, that could have at scale, right, implications for beneficial environmental implications, sustainability implications for the whole sector. And I share in that hope. But again, back to your point about skewed data, and right, if the BC example is so great, early on, one of the tools that I tried to validate is weed ID. because I thought to myself, I was on the east coast of Canada at the time, and I was interacting with horticulturalists, in particular blueberry farmers and fruit growers, and some of them were like, well, those tools for weed identification don't make sense for us, and I couldn't figure out what they meant. And I realized, because the tools are being developed in Midwestern US, right? And so they're not like the training data. So that's one of these things where, in order to validate the tool, one of the points of access that we need as a critical third party, right, is access to the training data, where you can look for things like skew or bias, just as we have done in other sectors where, for example, there have been critical oversight of search for Google search, right, around racial bias in the training data for search. And so we can ask similar sorts of questions, but again, we need transparency and access. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but I think Élise answered the question about Government of Canada very well.
No, and it's something that in this, like, I know I wear multiple hats, but this resonates with a lot of the discussions that we've been having in the forage sector. So I am vice chair of the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association as BC's representative for BC Forage Council, and we've done a lot of work on climate adaptation, mitigation, soil carbon, and we were one of the delivery partners for Agriculture Canada for the On-Farm Climate Action Fund. And the reason we were months delayed in implementing that program was because there was a serious question coming from that we knew our sector would be asking, is who owns the carbon? So we're getting federal dollars to implement all these beneficial management practices with the goal of increasing soil carbon. Am I giving away my rights to claiming that soil carbon or accessing that carbon market by participating in this program? So it took us quite a bit of time to negotiate the proper language around that. And I think that kind of leads to one of the questions we had in the mural of, is there a good understanding of why agriculture producers are concerned about government asking for data? It's things like that is where it seems harmless to participate in a program, but there's something else in the background that down the line is restricting producers' access to be able to potentially monetize the environmental goods and services they are providing. And for the forage and cattle sectors, there are substantial opportunities to do so. And we've seen, maybe just as the last point from my perspective, and then I'll open it up for additional comments from our presenters, we've seen the same concerns around water in BC. If I register with the government every single well, I know that 5 to 10 years down the line, you're going to make me pay for it. So like that's where the concerns come from, is these policies come in and the data collection, and there's this real distrust of how that data is going to be utilized, and potentially just causing more pressures or burdens on them, not because they don't want to be respectful, responsible land managers, but just because it feels like a lot of those discussions then get taken away from them. They don't have the agency to have input, and then it's kind of goes around and hurts them in the long run of kind of how do they stay in compliance. So that's, from my perspective, kind of like the two big examples that I've seen from producers kind of thinking about how is this information being used, and again, going back to with the water example, well, now you can't have a new well unless you prove that the watershed can provide that water, but that watershed hasn't been mapped. So we don't have any baseline data saying how much is out there, but it's now the onus on the producer to come up with that data in the hand. So it's like a complex number of kind of challenges that I've seen on the landscape that have kind of come through. Any kind of additional experience or feedback from the work that either Élise or Kelly have been doing kind of on those realms, or understanding any other perspectives of why agricultural producers are concerned about those type of aspects? Kelly?
Sure. When you were talking before about farmer trust, and one of the surprising things to me when I first started interviewing farmers across Canada on precision agriculture was that I thought they would be concerned about, because price setting is well known within the farm community, I thought they would be concerned about corporate uses of data. And many of them talked to me about they were concerned about government. and government oversight. And that was really surprising to me because, well, I don't think this is in contradiction with what I said before. I think there's an onus on the part of government to really take a leadership position to ensure data justice, that data be used for good and that harms are equitably distributed or minimized. I think that, I don't know, the Canadian government has a fairly good track record in terms of establishing privacy and like good faith uses of data. But obviously I don't have this firsthand experience that you've just shared with growers in BC. So maybe there's some history there that I just didn't know of, but that was really surprising to me. I did hear that from farmers. I would say that comment you made about sort of data being used against, that's in part one of the reasons why I don't always advocate for either privacy or access as a first step. I think it's important that there's transparency around the usage, especially in private sector, but certainly public sector too, so that folks with time and the privilege, like independent third-party researchers, can validate the tools, for example, right? But I don't think that generating access to raw data for farmers is necessarily something that we want to try to get at with the regulatory or policy reform, because it just puts a burden of proof on producers who are already busy, right? And there's that whole conversation around farmers now need to like skill themselves in terms of digital tools, but also digital literacy or critical, digital. And I think that's important. And I know that these workshop series are hoping to do part of that public interest education. I think it's important, but I think we need to be careful about advocating for that as a domain for regulatory reform as a first step, because producers are super busy and it's just not fair. So I think that access, it was just sort of related to that example you gave. And the privacy thing worries me a little bit because I think that the issues go far beyond privacy. And in fact, when you do a close reading of the legal agreement that the commercial tools use to keep data, right, to collect data from farms and then to keep data under lock and key, so to speak, privacy is used, it's almost weaponized, right? The companies advocate for a kind of very tight in-house control, like an operations control center by John Deere, all the data controlled by one party in one place. They advocate for that as a means to ensure producer privacy. And maybe there's some element of truth there. But at the same time, it creates vulnerabilities, as I gave the example, our thought experiment before around cybersecurity. And I think it also, you can see how things like privacy legislation are then used, right, as a tool against, I would say, equity or data justice. And so that's why I don't, as a first step, advocate for access or privacy, but rather transparency more broadly. And yeah, maybe Élise has.
No, I think you covered it well. I think it's such a complex area, Serena, and I hear you when you talk about like what happens 10 years down the road and so on and so forth. But I'd like to hear more, even from in terms of what are those key points of data that they need, right? There's a lot of data, and Kelly, I'm reacting to your, what else are we going to ask them to do, right? They need to be accountant, farmers, marketers, like now it's privacy law. And so how do we, and is there a role there for industry association or others in the sector as well, right? Not just like, I think we've been talking about researcher and government and individual farmers, but what about, provincial government and not just federal government, but those industry association, where do they come in? Like who advocates for that? Because and I'm going to link that back to another point you made earlier, Kelly, I'm sorry, about how little we talk sometimes about, like I live in agriculture all the time, being in agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. But even at the onset of the pandemic, it was like we had to elbow a little bit our way to the table in terms of emergency response, right? And it's the food security of the country. And it's a lot of those things that come into play, and where data would help us prepare better, but would also help us respond better. But we have to be transparent. We have to say why we need that information and when and how we're going to use it. And we need to make sure that like this is recognized too from an infrastructure perspective. And I think food ended up being in one of the 10 critical infrastructures. So that's opening up a different level of conversation. So how do we make sure that the farmers are part of the conversation, but at the same time, we're not just increasing the burden on them and asking them to become an expert in another field yet again, right? So I think there's for me, I don't have the answer to that question, but where's that other part of the equation, and how does it come in to bring that greater good? Because like Kelly, I'm still very much into the greater good, and I'm worried sometimes that we'll miss that aspect of it, being too worried about the what ifs of the negative. So how do we strike that balance here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate the nuances that we're able to get in here. I feel like there hasn't been enough avenues for us to really dig deep into these topics. So maybe just as a note to really thank both Sarah Louise and Shauna and Akarn for facilitating these series, because I'm definitely, taking a lot out of our discussions here, and thinking about some of the other questions that we have moving around. There is one around Indigenous organizations I don't want to lose maybe, but I'll loop back around to that shortly. The next question that kind of relates back to some of the security and maybe the concerns is how safe is the data being collected in the first place, and can Agriculture Canada make any promises around that data protection? But so that is a question that was upvoted. I think you kind of actually already just answered it, Élise, but maybe any additional thoughts to that specific question?
Absolutely. I think that I cannot make guarantee on behalf of AFC in that realm. I'm going to be very honest with you. I think that there's two angles to that. I think there's more and more work that we're doing as a department to work on raising awareness on cybersecurity with some of our partner in the industry, and we're going to continue to do that, because there's something about that aspect of security that is in the end of the beholder, right, to a certain extent. So I think that's a place where AFC has an opportunity to influence. In terms of data protection for, I think data that is collected is done. We have a lot of, I'm still not a techie, but there's a lot of IT security that comes into the work when we design system or we design programs. So we do our very best to protect the data, and I think that's part of the equation. But it's a lot of there's a lot of work that is happening in those areas across the country, and it's another shared responsibility, right? And it's that aspect of it is very important in the conversation. Someone once told me, you know what to do when the fire alarm rings at home, right? It's been drilled into you since you were little. But I'm not sure how mature we are in terms of knowing what to do if there's ransomware coming, if somebody comes into our system. And it's not just, I think we do it for our department, we do it for the project, but it's another collective conversation beyond just one department and one sector.
Yeah, Kelly, any additional thoughts?
I totally agree, Élise. I said, I kind of stepping back from the nitty gritty, although short today and hard to get into the nitty gritty, but I think one of the things that could happen is a kind of high level leadership, right, on the part of government to convene a conversation that's like policy, industry, other stakeholders and citizens. But I agree that another great idea that you've just had is a kind of and you hear this term used in AI regulation, more conversations more broadly, kind of co-design, right, of regulatory frameworks. So there's like data sharing frameworks in the design of technologies. I think, again, the kind of cat's out of the bag on that one, because the data are already being collected. In many cases, the tools are already developed. But there could be a kind of co-design approach taken within Government of Canada across sectors, because as we know, food connects, right, to everything, to environment, climate. One of the questions was about using data for climate mitigation, and industry. And I think it would be wrong if we, like has happened with data and AI regulation currently in government, right, if the leadership position is really, I said, or just Treasury Board, I think AFC can play a key role. And so I think a kind of, as Élise said, a kind of co-developed regulatory framework among departments within Government of Canada is a great idea.
Yeah, and following up exactly from that, Kelly, kind of thinking of shifting from all the concerns and potential barriers and thinking about the opportunity. So I do want to go ahead and ask the question from, my apologies if I get your name incorrect, Shmuel Yershulami, was thinking about just that. How do we look at the AI technologies and technologies surrounding agritech and how those can support agriculture in BC to really start taking on tackling climate change? And so thinking about the opportunities that do exist. Any initial thoughts there?
I can jump in first if you want, Kelly, on this one. I think there's tremendous opportunity attached to AI. I do think, though, and Kelly has been involved in that work, we do need to think about how much do we really know about how and how the data is treated, how the decisions are made, and how can we test that in a way that is effective. But like I can think of several projects, like in terms of using artificial intelligence, for example, to early detect disease and limit outbreaks. I can think about AI using predictive analysis to try to foresee what the impact of some disaster would be and where should we concentrate our resources to mitigate those impacts. Like the use cases are so many. But we have to stay vigilant, right? And make sure that we use the tools that we have, like we have some in the federal in terms of the AI automated decision making, but there's more that is needed. I know that in our research center, there's a lot of work that is happening, starting to look at those like application in terms of saving energies in greenhouses, for example, using AI to regulate. I've seen application in the pork sector with sensor in trailers to make sure that the animals that are being transported are in the best possible condition and that's monitored. Like those kinds of tasks can definitely offer some avenues for growth and for very positive impact on the sector and on the participants.
Yeah, that's great. I would say, I said it before, but I do share in the hope that in particular, the use of big data mined by machine learning algorithms to generate predictive insights could be used for all sorts of environmental sustainability goals, right, that we have for the food system, whether it's, kind of adaptation and using predictive analytics for flood management, right, and mapping water or hydrogeological systems. I know there's work in that area. There's work, on using automation to generate kind of best practices around animal welfare, especially in the dairying sector. There's this sort of precision tools that I talked about that can be used, right, to generate insights around farm management to help producers make more judicious use of harmful inputs that have greenhouse gas impacts, like the use of chemicals, right, which we know, right, it's in the production end of agrochemicals where there's a significant greenhouse gas emission. And so I think there's lots of hope that these tools could be used to amend the system as it currently is towards sustainability goals, not just climate. But again, not to say the same thing, I'm like a one-trick pony over and over, but I think one of the things I've been trying to do is to validate. So to look for sort of evidence on which tools work and in which ways, which again is a difficult thing to do because of a lack of transparency. But there is research, technical research, and I have an article that should be coming out soon that does do a meta review of the technical literature. But I think that's an important piece of the puzzle is to really kind of is to look systematically at what the benefits really are, and including environmental benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the notes that I kind of came into our panel today was thinking about these opportunities, and also just, again, from my lens of rural, maybe smaller scale operations, or I should not even smaller scale, there's a lot of acreages, lot of acres, but maybe more extensive, is that there are some specific challenges for smaller, medium-sized producers to access these technologies. A lot of them are connectivity. So we're installing living labs and we have no weather station. We're trying to install new weather stations to get baseline data in these regions for weather. And we can't utilize some of the technology because there's no internet. So those technologies don't exist. And then just affordability. So that kind of goes back to a question that was asked earlier, is any thoughts about like how we can empower small and medium-sized growers in this context? And is it even possible to do that data collection for that sector at this time?
Can I just hop in, because I forgot I meant to do a shout out, and I think Élise basically did it already, but to the Living Lab team that's working on precision agriculture and best management practices, I think climate in particular. I don't know, it's been a while since I connected with them, but I know that Isabelle Perron is here, I think, from that Living Lab in particular. And so I just wanted to do a shout out in terms of like what was currently going on within government to use data for climate mitigation. But yeah, that question, I accidentally answered it by text in the question, but that's one of my main concerns to the person who asked that question, is about, we know that there are sustainability benefits in terms of smaller, I mean, it's not always a scale thing, but right, smaller farms tend to be more biodiverse. They tend to, the transport of food happens over shorter distances. There are all sorts of sustainability and other kind of food system, like local food sovereignty benefits to supporting smaller scale and regional food production, and especially biodiverse production methods. And yet the tools that are being designed, especially by private sector, aren't really right. The digital revolution, the so-called digital revolution, is not necessarily aiming toward those very sustainable producers. And so this has been a real concern of mine for years. I've published on it, and I have a few projects where I work with producers at that scale to try to empower them, as you said, to try to think about their data and innovation needs, and to try to make visible some of the ongoing forms of, I would call it data-based innovation, right? It might not be the shiny precision agriculture tractor, but there's really innovative things happening on those farms. And so I put a website link to a current project of mine. And I know that Sarah Louise works on a project in BC. So there are people working on that piece of the puzzle. And I think, the AEFC has taken some leadership in this. There was a call put out several years ago with ISED for scaling down precision agriculture to fund, right? So that's not regulatory policy, but it's a program to fund smaller scale precision agriculture. And then some of the kind of broadband initiatives are aiming exactly at least broadband or data access issues among the smallest and, I guess, relatively marginal producers within Canada. So there are things being done to seek redress for that gap, but it's a gap and it concerns me.
And I won't add too much. We're getting close to the end. I think Kelly has answered this fantastically. I would say there's programs that exist both at the federal level and in the provinces as well that are in place. But I think the point Kelly made in terms of scale and where do we find those opportunities is super important. And that speaks also to how do we ensure that agriculture, the reality, which is a very diverse and dispersed kind of industry, right? We need to remember that is understood to the best way possible by other partners in the ecosystem, right? Because it's not all AFC, right? There's a lot, there's ECCC, which is Environment Canada. There's a lot of those other players that are also part of that mesh.
Yeah, both great points. I think it's there's a lot of opportunities there. I'm happy to hear more about your work, about the work that's being done and to address it. And I think a lot of it too, from a practical sense, is a lot of these producers aren't used to having any data. So just even introducing the concept of how these could be incorporated when they're coming from ground zero without any experience. So I'm gonna push our time a little bit and ask one last question. I am gonna say that we had a question about sharing best practices when utilizing data associated with Indigenous organizations. And I think that's a very important, very large topic, but I think I want to table it so we actually give it enough time in an appropriate time for those discussions. So maybe something we can I do believe we dive into more specifically later in this series. So I will end with the question that came in from Gary Larson. So the evolution of data sharing landscape is evolving faster than our best practices to manage. Broad scale challenges are bringing government, NGOs, industry, Indigenous, and producer data in different iterations with different expectations. Do we have any tips for trying to navigate the development of formal data sharing relationships in these cases? Élise.
That's a very good question. There is a lot of work that is happening on that front I know, for example, at Guelph University, right, in terms of data sharing agreement and in that area. I don't think I can cover that in the time coming. And I think that other expert would be better than me, but I think this is a very live conversation, not just from the information asymmetry perspective that I talked about earlier, right? Like the very fine print, 28 pages, but there's something about how can we tool and how can we equip the different partners to have those data sharing and those data agreement in place. So I think I'll leave it at that for now because it's 1:30.
Yes.
And I don't know if Kelly wants to jump in.
I would just say I mentioned two possible like different arrangements, and they both of the ideas I think are fleshed out fairly or well developed in that report that I linked to in my PowerPoint presentation that was written with a nonprofit organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's mostly about data governance arrangements, alternative data governance arrangements for different sort of strategies. The one that I think makes a lot of sense for development in the global northern and maybe Canadian context is a kind of fiduciary, like a sharing of basically financial benefits from the collection of farm data as just one, but there's also there's other ones as well that are detailed in that report. So I would point people toward that report.
Awesome. Thank you both. And I'm going to pass it over to our organizers to wrap us up. I know I'm always a little over time. I push it a little.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was such an interesting conversation. Thank you, Serena Black, for moderating, to Élise and Kelly for presenting, and for this really engaging discussion. Definitely has helped me think differently about these topics and how we could parse out data governance and handle different types of data. There's always more questions and reflections after. So the mural board that's been shared numerous times, that's a place where you can add more questions and any takeaways from today's session. And we'll be sharing that out as an ongoing resource. I also just want to thank everyone who's joined today. And I hope you are planning to join our last two sessions in this series. So we have a session on June 7th, also Wednesday morning at 9 Pacific, and it's going to be focusing on community-led data governance and farmer-controlled data. So really looking at grassroots efforts to create solutions, technical solutions for farm data. And Greg Ostick and Doran Cox will be joining us for that. And then the final session on June 14th will be focusing on Indigenous data sovereignty. So more to come, and so interesting. We will be sharing out in our wrap-up materials both the recording and links to the resources that both of our speakers shared today. And I just want to again just thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, who are supporting this year-long project through Connections Grant. So thank you, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Yeah, and thanks so much to our presenters and moderator.